What if the Cold War had turned hot, not in Europe or Vietnam, but over the ancient cities of a newly born nation? What if, in a moment of panic, the United States unleashed the atomic bomb, this time, on China? This is not fiction. In the late 1940s, Washington's highest corridors of power quietly debated a plan that could have changed the world forever. The target was not the Soviet Union. The target was China. The story begins in the aftermath of World War II, as America stood alone with the atomic bomb, a weapon that promised security, but also carried a terrible burden. The men who wielded this power believed they were safeguarding freedom, but fear of a new enemy tempted them to consider the unthinkable. This hidden chapter of the Cold War reveals how close the world came to nuclear catastrophe. History is not a steady march of progress, it's a series of close calls, moments when a single decision could have sent humanity down a darker path. The plan to drop atomic bombs on China was one such moment, born of fear, debated in secret, and ultimately abandoned. Understanding how this plan came to be, and why it was shelved, shows us the fragile nature of peace in the atomic age. The decision-makers were not villains, but men shaped by war, struggling to navigate a world where alliances shifted and new threats emerged. In this new conflict, the lines between defense and aggression became dangerously blurred, and in the background, America's nuclear monopoly was slipping away, adding urgency to every choice. The world stood unknowingly on the precipice of disaster. This is the story of how we stepped back from the edge. The year was 1949. The world, still reeling from World War II, watched as China's civil war reached its climax. Mao Zedong's communist forces swept across the mainland, toppling the American-backed nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek. On October 1st, Mao proclaimed the People's Republic of China. Shockwaves hit Washington. The loss of China was seen as a catastrophic failure of American policy, a psychological blow that fueled fears of a global communist conspiracy. The domino theory took hold. If China fell, would Korea, Indochina, or the Philippines be next? Chiang and his followers fled to Taiwan, vowing to retake the mainland. The United States, having lost its partner in China, faced a stark choice: how to deal with a hostile regime in Beijing, and how to contain the spread of communism in Asia. In this atmosphere of crisis and fear, the most extreme options began to be considered. The unthinkable, nuclear war, was about to be placed on the table. American leaders saw communism as a monolithic threat, not a collection of movements. The fall of China transformed a regional conflict into a global showdown. The stakes had never felt higher. The world seemed on the brink of a new, more terrifying era, and in the minds of US policymakers, no option was off limits. The rise of communist China sent shockwaves through American politics. The loss of China sparked bitter debate in Washington, with Republicans accusing Truman of being soft on communism. No leader wanted to appear weak, pushing the nation toward more aggressive stances. Communism was seen as a single, monstrous entity controlled by Moscow. Mao's victory was viewed as a strategic win for Stalin, fueling fears of a unified communist bloc. This fear became the organizing principle of US foreign policy, leading to the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and NATO. The strategy was containment, but some wondered if that was enough. Should America simply contain communism or roll it back by force? In tense National Security Council meetings, military planners were asked, what if China invaded Taiwan? What if war broke out in Korea? In this climate, the atomic bomb, America's ultimate weapon, entered the conversation. The world was teetering on the edge of a new kind of war. No one embodied America's aggressive stance more than General Douglas MacArthur. As Supreme Commander in Japan, MacArthur saw Asia as his domain and communism as a direct threat. He argued that Taiwan was a vital strategic asset and urged military aid for Chiang Kai-shek. But MacArthur's ambitions went further. He saw the atomic bomb as a viable tool if China intervened in Asia. He envisioned using nuclear strikes to destroy China's military and break its will to fight. MacArthur's calls for escalation put him at odds with President Truman, who feared a wider war and Soviet involvement. Yet MacArthur dismissed these concerns, convinced that overwhelming force would intimidate both Beijing and Moscow. His advocacy for nuclear options pushed the unthinkable closer to reality. The military establishment began to plan for scenarios once thought impossible. The world was one decision away from disaster. In the Pentagon, fears became blueprints. The Joint Chiefs developed detailed plans for war with China, codenamed Shakedown and Off Tackle. The atomic bomb was the centerpiece. Targets included Manchurian industry, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Beijing. B-29 bombers were put on standby, crews trained for long-range missions. Military leaders argued that a conventional war in China would be a nightmare. Nuclear strikes offered a quick, decisive victory. The destruction of a few cities, they reasoned, was a price worth paying to stop communism. Planning was cold and clinical, calculating bombs, altitudes, and flight paths. The men behind these plans were professionals, not monsters, but they operated in a world where nuclear weapons were becoming normalized. The line between strategy and catastrophe was razor thin. The machinery of Armageddon was ready to turn. Despite detailed plans and MacArthur's pressure, America hesitated. War weariness gripped the public. The nation had just survived World War II and craved peace. Truman knew Americans were tired of sacrifice and not ready for another distant war. China, once an ally, was not seen as an existential enemy like Nazi Germany. Within Truman's administration, moral unease grew. Using the bomb again so soon felt different. Some worried about America's standing in the world if it resorted to mass destruction. Hawks pushed for action, but doves urged caution and diplomacy. Truman was caught in the middle, torn between appearing strong and his own reservations. This hesitation became a critical break on the rush to war. The fate of millions hung in the balance. The greatest deterrent to bombing China was not public opinion, but the Soviet Union's shadow. China and the USSR had signed a treaty. An attack on China could trigger a global war. The nightmare World War III fought with nuclear weapons. In August 1949, the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb. America's nuclear monopoly was over. The world changed overnight. Now, any US nuclear strike risked Soviet retaliation. The doctrine of massive retaliation cut both ways. Mutual vulnerability became the new reality. The Soviet bomb forced a fundamental reassessment of US strategy. A quick nuclear strike on China now seemed reckless, even suicidal. The very weapon meant to guarantee security had created a balance of terror. The plan to bomb China became an unacceptable gamble. The world's fate now rested on a fragile equilibrium. The decision to shelve the plan came gradually, as leaders realized the catastrophic risks. Soviet nuclear capability, the threat of a massive ground war, and lack of public support made restraint the only option. Truman, conscious of history, chose caution. The blueprints for Armageddon were quietly filed away. The world stepped back from the abyss, unaware how close it had come. The Korean War would test this resolve again, but Truman refused to use nuclear weapons, even firing MacArthur for his defiance. For decades, the plan to nuke China remained secret, only revealed years later. It's chilling to imagine. A nuclear attack on China could have triggered World War III, with bombs falling on cities across the globe. The world as we know it might not exist. This forgotten chapter is a warning. History often turns on secret decisions made in fear. When the unthinkable becomes an option, humanity's survival hangs by a thread.